In this episode, I am once again joined by Alan Chapman, British writer, occultist, and spiritual teacher. Alan reflects on his search for true awakening, compares the spiritual traditions of the West and the East, and questions the liberal ideal of the universal man. Alan presents Merlin as the archetype of the Western adept, asserts theosis to be the true purpose of Christianity, and reveals the language of the birds. Alan also offers advice for those who have had an awakening, discusses Gnosticism and Pragmatic Dharma, and critiques the idea that contemplative neuroscience is the fourth turning of Buddhism. So without further ado, Alan Chapman.
Alan Chapman, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. It's always a pleasant surprise when that happens.
Well, I'm so pleased that you've come back, in fact. And gosh, that first episode was so fascinating. I said last time that in this episode, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the things you've written in the books you've published.
Yeah.
And I had two questions really to start off. The first one is, are you a book guy? Do you like books? I'm the kind of person, I like books and reading books and buying books and things like that. And I do understand those are very separate hobbies. I'm acutely aware of that. So I'm wondering about that. What's your relationship to books in general? And also, secondly, if you might give us a bit of a timeline, if you want, of the various books you've published, Advanced Magic for Beginners and so on, Magia, etc.
Yes. I think the background of my video gives it away. I am a book guy. I do love books as objects. I'm that cliche. My relationship with books is, what can I say? It's always been one of it's like someone looking for gold, sifting for gold, looking for something that might be buried in a text where most of it is not what I'm looking for, but you'll find the little nuggets. Meaning I'll read books that aren't necessarily books I'd recommend for people to read. Does that make sense? Like I know what I'm looking for, and then when I find it, that can inform whatever it is that I'm interested in, right? So people always ask me, are there any books that I recommend, and I always struggle with that. My book purchasing has accelerated over the last couple of years because I did a lot of research on Aleister Crowley. So I had to review all of the stuff written about Crowley, academic or otherwise, near enough everything written by Crowley. So there was a lot of book purchasing that was going on. Of course, I love doing that because some of these books are hard to find, and tracking them down and then, owning this, a rare book that has this content in there. I mean, there is something, what can I say? I'm a sucker for that. I'm a sucker for that. As for books that I've written, the first thing that I published, I think, was The Camel Rides Again, which is a little booklet that I published in was it 2005 or 6 or something like that. It was a precursor to Advanced Magic for Beginners. So I wrote that. I think I did some other little ebooks as I was creating the content for the blog, The Baptist Head, with my friend Duncan. And I think it's 2006, 2007 when Advanced Magic for Beginners came out. This is a book that I didn't know I was writing. I think that's a nice heuristic for anyone who wants to write a book, is to not think that you're actually writing a book. Instead, write about something that interests you. Do it enough, and you'll discover you've got enough chapters for a book. And that's basically what I did with Advanced Magic for Beginners. Around about that time, I also had an article published in the 14 Times that was about the origin of the lamb image or portrait that Aleister Crowley drew, that Kenneth Grant turned it into this myth about aliens, about an alien. My contention is, after looking at the details and providing the receipts, is that actually it's a portrait of Lao Tzu, which Crowley drew from memory, from recovered past lives. Anyway, that was published, and then that was it until 2019. Well, actually, no, it's more like 2021. I finished working on the Magia text. That was then I self-published that because I knew I had to take care of that text in a very particular way. So I just self-published that on Amazon. And then the publisher who published Advanced Magic for Beginners relented and offered to publish The Baptist's Head. Now, The Baptist's Head, these were 3 books that were self-published round about the time of Advanced Magic for Beginners. Duncan did all the work on those books. It was a phenomenal amount of work. There was 3 of them, and we co-authored them. It's basically the content from the Baptist's Head that what can I say? It catalogues our experiences going through different states and stages, exploring different traditions, that kind of thing. So it's a record of our experience on the path from those days. And at the time, our publisher wasn't interested in, I say our publisher because Duncan published Occult Experiments in the Home round about the time I did Advanced Magic for Beginners, his own little magical book. Yes, our publisher wasn't interested in publishing The Baptist's Head at the time. He thought no one would be interested. Recently, he realized that people would be interested, and so the 3 volumes were published together as one compendium, and that's the Baptist's Head compendium. So I've not actually published that much. I'm working on more books, and I imagine most of my output will be, over the next couple of years in terms of my writing career. Yeah.
Are you in a position to give us a hint as to what's coming?
Yes. So I'm currently writing what can only be described as an exegesis of the Magia text. I can't think of another word for what it might be. It is, if the text is for everyone, the Magia text is for everyone, the exegesis is specifically for students. So it elaborates on the content of what's in the book, and including with the practices as well. So I'm currently writing that, and there is a lot of content, some of which is in the videos that I posted on my website, which will probably be a book at some point. And that will be, I imagine that will more heavily look like Gnosticism, or the Gnostic content of the Magia teaching. That will come at some point. I'm doing my best not to presume what will actually happen, because I often make plans for books and that kind of a thing, and it turns out I'm always being too eager. I'm always being too hasty, and things will come in their own time. An example of that, by the way, is a book that should have come out this year, which is Magic Without Tears. So a new edition of Magic Without Tears by Aleister Crowley, which I reorganized and edited to be more in line with what he imagined it to be, to make it accessible to students. I do think with the right treatment, it's the best introduction to Crowley and his practices and what he thought about things. And then the research that I talked about on why I needed all the books, that informed an introductory biographical essay on Crowley, which presents a different picture of what happened in his life and what it was that he was doing. That book should have come out this year. The OTO, which is I think I've described it before as it's like the Scientology church for Thelemites. They sued my publisher, so the book was cancelled. Yes, so that should have come out. What will happen with that, we will see. But there were another 9 volumes planned, and there's a lot more stuff I need to say about Crowley that I imagine everyone will hate. Well, because both Thelemites and Christians, no doubt. But yes, there's all of that stuff that's that's on the boil, so to speak.
I suppose these things, these insights into Crowley, you want to save them, do you? For it's fruitless me asking you about them now, is it? That's okay if that's the case. I understand.
Yes, it's probably best to wait. It's probably best to wait because I don't know if I will do it justice. Yeah, and the most frustrating thing is I did a talk at the Oxford Thelemic Symposium. I think it was last year in October. Was it October or September? Again, you can find the video through my website, barbarouswords.com, and I present in broad strokes like some of the outcomes from the research that I did with Crowley. However, it doesn't have the same richness as what the essay does, and the scholarship that's gone into it. So there's frustration there about wanting to talk about this stuff, and yet the audience not being able to have access, to what it is that I'm talking about to appreciate it. So yes, it's probably best to park that for now.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you mostly read within magic, spiritual kinds of traditions? Do you read much outside of that? What sort of things do you like to read?
I have very little time to read fiction, so it's mostly non-fiction. And predictably, most of that non-fiction is related in some way to what we might broadly call spirituality. Yes, it's not limited to books that are considered magical or occult. In fact, that's probably the smallest part of my library. There's there might be something like the New Test the creation of the New Testament, the first version of that by Marcion, which will be an academic text. I find that to be interesting. Tibetan Zen, that was something I got recently. Again, that's another academic text, but I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. Research about something that is surprising in terms of what the details might be hidden within the origin of things. And how things come to be, where they're carried from, and then where they end up. I think that's an underappreciated aspect of lineage or teaching or traditions is the need for people to go to a geographical location in order to gather something up. And I don't just mean through book learning, right? To gather something up and then to take it to somewhere else to plant it so that it will sprout. I think that's an underappreciated aspect and the necessity for it. So it's not the case that someone somewhere can just give birth or rather facilitate the rebirth of something because it's all purely mental or spiritual or something like that, and geography doesn't play a role. It may be the case that you have to go somewhere, find something in a different part of the garden, bring it back with you and graft it onto something else, right? Which this is a very old way of understanding the nature of transmission. What transmission is that it's the grafting of one plant to another or one tree to another.
That's Sam Van Sheik, isn't it? Tibetan Zen. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the points of discourse that one sometimes hears, I think, in occult circles is this idea of a Western tradition. And sometimes that's opposed against, I suppose, Eastern traditions, for example, Buddhism, Advaita, whatever the case may be, Zen. And some people in those circles mix them together and try to make a kind of Vajrayana with Hecate or something.
Yeah.
Other people keep them rather separate, or some people, it seems, they feel they move from an occult interest and then they become Buddhists or something like that, and they leave it behind and they see it as a sort of graduation or so.
Yeah.
There are also then various ideas people have about lineage, continuity, a sense of it's been lost here, we have to go there, or it's still here, we have to pick it up, we shouldn't go over there because then we're leaving behind the thing that's here. So all these kinds of ideas that one hears. So this is coming to my mind because of your metaphor of the garden. How do you see this mixing that people do, or the keeping apart, etc., loyalty to this, or etc.?
I think so. First of all, the there is the idea of the tradition behind traditions, right? And this goes wherever it needs to go, and will give rise to traditions wherever it needs to do that. And it can move from east to west to east to west, right? Like breathing. It's like breathing, right? Or the tides. It's like a natural rhythm. That certainly is the case. That certainly happens. However, also in tandem with that, there's a truth, a reality, which is, I think, probably best expressed by a phrase from Carl Jung, which is, you shouldn't go looking for treasure in a foreign field. Right. It's a curious phrase. I went to India, right? It's such a cliche. I go to India and I meet a guru and experience enlightenment, awakening. Now, I only do that because I've been doing these practices that belong to what's apparently a Western tradition. Myself and Duncan were in a unique position during the practical Dharma days, you know, when the Dharma overground was in its prime. Most people belonged to Eastern traditions, Buddhism, or well, I mean, it was mostly Buddhism, variations of Buddhism. But we were coming from this Western tradition. And what do we mean by Western tradition? Crowley's work. So we're invoking the Holy Guardian Angel. We're taking that route. We're engaging with ritual as a means of expressing our participation in this path, right? And we're exploring. And so I got to see it from both sides, if you like, because it's informed by these teachers and colleagues and friends who you know, are deeply immersed in Buddhism, with, you know, the text and the literature and so on, exposure to all of that. But I'm getting to see it from this Western side as well, and that led to magical experiences with prophecy, that kind of a thing, and eventually culminated in me traveling. But I'm ending up in India. I've gone to the east. Whilst I'm in India, I had a dream, and it was after I'd been to Sri Aurobindo's ashram. I went to Sri Aurobindo's ashram. I had a particular kind of an experience at the samadhi being the tomb where he was buried, and the mother was buried there, and I had a particular kind of experience there, spiritual experience. But I had a curious dream, and the dream was, I was stood in a field. Ramana Maharshi was there as a child, and he was with my stepmother, right? And she was holding his hand. And I heard the phrase, and I'm going to paraphrase here, because I can't quite remember the exact phrasing, but it was more or less this. It was, "Don't go looking for the Supreme Lord in the fields." It was the phrase like this. And I woke up and I was really puzzled. Now, the thing about Sri Aurobindo is that he worked with a woman called the Mother. You see, my stepmother is a mother that isn't my mother, right? And I was puzzled at this time by the nature of the mother who was working with Sri Aurobindo. What was her function and so on. I don't know why Ramana Maharshi was there. He was just there. But obviously he's representing the Supreme, right? The Supreme Consciousness or the Supreme Being or something like that. It's very interesting that he was presented as a child. The Supreme as the you know, the divine child, something like this. And I didn't know for a number of years what that really meant until I came across that phrase in Jung, where he says, "Don't go looking for treasure in a foreign field." Funnily enough, he went to India and had this experience. It was a very similar experience. He had his famous dream in Kolkata of searching for the Holy Grail. There's a dream there that's very famous. Anyway, I won't go into that, but not long after that, I then ended up at Tiruvannamalai, Ramana Maharshi's ashram, and it was what I would now understand or express as an empty institute. All the institutions are empty. If you want to go looking for awakening, you're going to want to go looking for the real thing. You might think, I'll go to this Buddhist temple here. I'll go to this monastery there. And what you discover, however, is that the institutions are empty. You may find someone in there right? Who you might not expect is part of the real thing, right? Or the strange person who sits in the corner of the church, right? And it's not the priest, or a monk or whatever, and you go and talk to them. It was the same at Ramana Maharji's ashram. I went there thinking I'm going to find a lineage of enlightened people, and that's all they'll talk about. But it wasn't. It was just the clergy. It was just people worshipping, the statue of Ramana Maharshi, and attending with the upkeep and that kind of thing of the place. And curiously, I found someone who claimed to be awakened, and that's what they were interested in. And lo and behold, he was a Westerner. He was a Western guy from America. And that was the culmination of that particular point in my journey, in my progress, was sitting with this guy. And of course, it continues after that. So now, what does it mean to not go looking for treasure in a foreign field? What it means is that there is a inescapable cultural, ethnic, what can we say, inheritance for every individual that you find yourself embedded within, and it goes deep into the unconscious, how you approach things and think about things, such that there can be a pathological development if you try and approach things that you are not equipped to approach in the same way that someone else from a different culture might approach it. Right. That's what it's speaking to. It's saying there is a way of engaging with this thing that's peculiar to your own nature. Right. And you can do that. Now, the fact that Buddhism has taken the form that it has in the West compared to how it is in the East just demonstrates this. Just demonstrates it. It becomes radically westernized or whatever. You can see with Buddhism in the West, with the early pioneers who went to study in the East, in Thailand, in the forest tradition, and other places, and they come back and bring it to the West. It quickly becomes interpreted in terms of political concerns from the people involved. So there is a book called, this is such an unfortunate name. There's a book called JewBu, right? I think some publicist or whatever coined this term thinking that people would use it, but it's like anything that's artificially created. It's cringy as a popular term, but it was the recognition that there was a big Jewish influence on how Buddhism has been shaped in America, such that a particular kind of Jewish political activism informs our understanding of things like loving kindness or that kind of a thing. And so the JewBu was a celebration of the contribution of Jewish culture to Western Buddhism, but it's some very particular flavor. Like that's what's gonna happen. It's this. You can see something similar with the strains of Buddhism now that's informed by what might be disparagingly called tech bro culture. That kind of informs this approach to what mindfulness is. It gets denuded of anything that might be considered incompatible or superstitious with our Western rationalistic view of things. So often all of the magical elements get divorced from it. Most of the stuff that you might think belongs in occultism that doesn't have anything to do with waking up or non-duality or that kind of a thing, it's all there in the traditions in the East. You can't divorce these two things from each other. You find a lot of teachers in the West, particularly with Advaita, Vedanta, that kind of a thing. There are things they won't talk about, that they don't talk about, that's inherent to the path. Visions, remembering past lives, all these things. They will pretend none of that exists and then talk in a very peculiar way, which maybe uncharitably I would describe as pseudo-Advaita. So anyway, you can see that there's this accommodation, right, of a teaching to one's inherited nature in a very basic, primarily unconscious sense that happens. And I think what happens there is that this informs a sense of a need to belong, right? You want your tradition. Where's my tradition? I'm looking for my tradition. Where can I finally belong? A lot of the time, this it's not that it's impossible for, say, a Westerner to go to the East and then accommodate themselves, but it's a big ask, and you'll always be an outsider, and there will always be some sense of disparity between certain things. But for the most part, it's like you want to find something that expresses what you care about in an explicit way, and you can rest there. There's a sense, if I can just find the thing, I found the thing, I don't have to think about it anymore. It's a burden having to think about where you belong, what tradition you should have, that kind of a thing. In the West, we have the failures of exoteric Christianity. It's left us void. We need something, and so if we don't fully commit to some kind of Eastern tradition, there can be this impulse to try and create one's own system. You take what is useful, discard what is useless, make your own little mishmash of a system up. This is worse, I think, than trying to accommodate yourself to an ill-fitting cultural expression from somewhere else. It won't hold. That kind of thing doesn't hold, and it isn't the thing that you're looking for. It's just an extraordinarily bad parody, of what tradition is. People think tradition is someone making things up and fitting it together in a rational way. Like, that's what they think tradition is, rather than the fact that it's something that's organic, that comes from somewhere else. It's spoken for, it's created from somewhere else, and it's planted by something else bigger than you, with a purpose you might not fully understand, right? So it's informed by a divine wisdom, which no amount of best guesses and cutting edge ideas can make up for. Right, it's not a good placeholder for it. Anyway, yes. So you find the searching, the need to engage with genuine spirituality. You go to church, you're not going to find it. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. Not only is there nothing there, it's actually, this is wrong. Actually, I'm going to back up and just say this. There's something of a revival happening with Christianity at the moment, right? And part of that is this trend of people joining Orthodox churches, becoming Orthodox. And there's a view there that where they still have Christian mysticism as part of it. They still recognize I'm going to go there. But actually, even in Catholicism, even in Anglicanism, like, it's there in the Bible that the purpose of Christianity is theosis, right? To become gods. It's there in the Bible. It's even recognized by these churches. So it's actually wrong to say it's not in there, because it is, and it's even in there in the so-called fallen version in the West. The way that Orthodoxy sees the church in the West is that it's fallen or whatever. They have their own problems in Orthodoxy. It's not as clear cut as all of this stuff. Anyway, the problem is this: you'll go to church, you're not finding someone saying to you the meaning of life is theosis, and that's what we're all aiming at. Let's go for it, right? You're not going to find that. But people think maybe they're finding that, turning to Orthodoxy and so on. There are other reasons why there's a resurgence in Christianity, but we'll just park that for a second. People might go looking then at occultism because the texts seem to imply that there's something else going on, some real spirituality, real experiences, engaging with the real thing that you're not going to find in church. So they look at that. Unfortunately, all of that stuff is tainted with what I would call a false, perverted view of the path, which is the idea that trauma for your own good is how one proceeds. Right, trauma for your own good. Just little steps, crossing the line of your conscience, right? And that somehow that transgression, this is where we get power from. This is where we get realization from, or liberation, something like this. So a lot of people crash and burn in occultism. I think some sensible people, they engage with this stuff. They find it's incoherent. They can't there's an element of making your own system with occultism. It's like you're dabbling in different things, trying to make sense of it. You don't have a community around you. You don't have a teacher. A lot of people who are figures in occultism have no real experience of anything, approaching what we might call awakening or that kind of a thing. In fact, a lot of them might say it's got nothing to do with it, which is an extraordinary statement in and of itself. Sensible people will see the practices, or the people who do these practices. It doesn't seem to be leading in a good direction, right? And then they'll start. Then maybe they discover something like orthodoxy, or maybe then they discover Buddhism, maybe esoteric Buddhism, and that'll scratch the itch. They retain some of the stuff that's more interesting, that's richer, and then they'll park themselves there. You can't blame someone for doing that, can you? Really? I mean, it's an understandable trajectory. Trauma for your own good can be expressed in a number of ways, not least of which is taking ridiculous amounts of psychedelics or entheogens, continuous drug use, thinking that if I just take the right dose, if I have enough of these experiences, that's going to give me what I'm looking for. And it won't. You can destroy yourself with spiritual experience. In Magia, the idea that we have of ourselves, the model we have, is to think of ourselves as a lamp made of a stone called alabaster. Alabaster stone lets the light through. It lets the light through, but it prevents the fire from coming into contact with the forest. The forest being human beings, because we're all trees, right? So it prevents the fire coming into contact with those people, right? Who if they come into contact with the fire, it's going to destroy them, right? And it could even destroy yourself. If you are not a fit lamp to carry the light, right? The higher up you go in the mountain, the winds might blow the fire out of the lamp, might set fire to the nearby trees, might set fire to yourself. So there's a necessary amount of work that's required to be a fit vessel, and it's imperative that the fire doesn't come into contact with that which is flammable, but the light's let through, and that's the important thing. The light is what does the work, right? And by understanding ourselves as lamps, we don't mistake ourselves for the light as human beings. If we mistake ourselves for the light as human beings, that's inflation, right? That's an error. So profound spiritual experience. You can have profound spiritual experience, and so to speak, you set yourself on fire, and those around you just causes great damage. Yes. So what does this mean? Well, what it doesn't mean is that actually there is no Western tradition. And by Western tradition, we mean the tradition behind traditions at work in the West, giving rise to particular expressions of the tradition, fit for this part of the garden. Right? Fit for this part of the garden. That tradition had to go underground in the West, right? You might even say it had to do a similar thing in the East as well, but I'm talking about in Christendom, it had to go underground because of this preoccupation with orthodoxy and heresy. It goes underground, and it starts with the Gnostics. Speaking of Christianity from the beginning, starts with the Gnostics, goes underground. We find it running through alchemy and so on, and this is what occultism actually is. It means the hidden tradition. It doesn't just mean dabbling with some kind of medieval grimoire to speak to demons or something. What it really means is there's this hidden teaching, often explicitly talking about the goddess Sophia. Right, but it runs under the surface, and there sometimes it erupts, like we find during the heresy of the free spirit in medieval Europe. Christian mystics, heretics, these people, we find it expressed in people like Aleister Crowley. Yeah. On the surface, it looks like he's not talking about the same thing as the Christian mystics, or, they have a lot more in common than what the surface would suggest. But one expression of it is the thing that I was following from Crowley led to a flowering or the production of a fruit, which we might call the teaching Magia, is an expression of this Western tradition, and the content of which is perhaps as an entryway best understood as the rebirth of Gnosticism. Right, even though the tradition itself is actually older than Gnosticism, it goes back to Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean. But that's what I would say is the current living expression of it. Right. So what do I mean by that? I mean if you are drawn to realize who and what you are in the most fundamental way, directly, with refined practices, an orientation, and a community that does that, right? That's what Magia is. So in antiquity, it's common to come across these old texts. You find it in Hermeticism, you find it in Gnosticism, and various other traditions where you would have a group of people who would work with a teacher, and they have these texts, and often the texts are attributed to great teachers. People think that's them trying to commit fraud, right? But really, it's a way of saying they've inherited the work from an ancestor, right? So it's that old structure, it's that structure. That's a living thing that exists now. That's what Magia is. So the Western tradition is something that does exist. It does exist. It's expressed and cultivated for this part of the garden in an appropriate fashion, and there are peculiarities to it. I'll give an example. I'll give an example of what I mean by the differences. I think in our last conversation, I did talk about the Eastern ideal of what an awakened person looks like, or a wise person, or a spiritually mature person. And it's the Buddha sat under a tree, right? It's stillness, it's alertness, it's peace, calm, etc. Sometimes sat on a throne. Sometimes it's the guru. Sometimes it's guru yoga. That's recognized. In some traditions in India, the guru is considered more important than the king, than the Raj. You see that sometimes depicted in the artwork and so on. But anyway, in the West, what does it look like? It actually looks like Merlin, the myth of Merlin, and the real person that was based on. It looks like the crazy person in the forest, right? That prophesies, the prophet. That's the ideal. That's how it's understood in the West. It's the person who goes off on their own, but they are considered dangerous, right? But also divinely inspired, right? So they're an essential element to the spiritual life of a culture, but they're kept outside the village, something like that, right? It's not what Merlin became. Merlin became domesticated. He became like the wise counsel to the king, right? The wizard who casts spells and whatever, and he's a wise whatever. No, the earlier versions, it's a guy who's crazy, possibly based on the real story of I believe he was a Scottish man. I think he was Scottish, who saw war. He went to war and was driven mad by what he saw, by the horrors of it and the sorrow. And he went mad and he ran into the forest to live in the forest. But then he began to prophesy. It's the wild man in the wood. Now, I'm not saying that's what that physically you will go and live in a potato sack in the forest and eat moss. I'm not saying that's what you should do, but what I am saying is it's understood that the function of a person who pursues this process is isn't someone sat on a throne, right? Who is unperturbed. It's someone divinely inspired. It's someone who may give advice or something like that, but it's something to contend with. It will be a challenge. And there's also an added element here, an esoteric element here, which is about disappearing in the forest. And that would lead us to the language of the birds. So in one of the earliest expressions of Merlin's story, where he's always understood as a prophet from God, right? He's brought the gospel to Europe. This particular expression is found in France, this cycle, where he, at the end of the story, he disappears into his esplumoir. Now, esplumoir is apparently, it seems like it's a made-up French word, right? So no one's quite sure what it means, but it shares an etymological origin with the French word for the shedding of feathers. The shedding of feathers. So he disappears into the forest in his esplumoir. What this implies is that he turned into a bird. And at the end of the story, he's disappeared into the forest, and he will stay there until the end of time, until the world comes to an end. That's his function. So he disappears into the forest, and he'll stay there. And that's the culmination of the path of the prophet in terms of Merlin's story. Now, what does that have to do with the language of the bird? Shall I segue into that? Yeah. So I'll start with this. So sometimes you come across ideas about angels, right? Where in Christian mystical texts or in other Abrahamic mystical traditions, wherever you come across a bird, it's sometimes considered a symbol for an angel. But that's what it is, right? But really, they're angels. Angels are people with wings. And that's how often they're depicted. But the truth is, whenever you see an angel, which is a human being with wings, really, right, that's a symbol for a bird. Because birds, and bear with me now, bear with me now, birds are the true messengers from the true earth. That's their function in this world. Right. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, I just prefaced this by saying the archetype or the model for the teacher in the West is the madman in the woods. So no doubt that's how I'm now going to sound. Inescapably. Okay. There is in Magia, there is this understanding that there's this earth, right? And then there's a true one. There's the true earth. We think that we are on the real earth now, living a human life, and when we die, we'll go to the underworld, Hades or something like that. A very, very old teaching, a very old way of understanding things is actually, no, we're actually in the underworld now. This place is merely a shadow of the true earth. True earth. And in that cosmology, we have the true earth, where life is ideal, where things are the way that they're supposed to be, where things are not fallen. Right, this is like a fallen world or a damned world. It's a shadow of this other place. The messengers from that place are the birds, and they come here, and they bring seeds from that other world, and they plant them here. That's what they do. And it's the action of the birds that allows life to take place and growth to take place. Now, this might sound like fancy poetic language, can't possibly be true. It's probably being it's symbolism for something. But this is also why I led into this by saying, on the contrary, when we see symbols like an angel, a person with wings, that's a symbol for what a bird is, and not the other way around. What is the language of the birds? Right? How do I know that what I'm saying is true? And it was a surprise to me. What I'm telling you now is a surprise to me. And this is why I think in our previous conversation, I'm sure I mentioned this, when you get past the whole emptiness, non-dual, abiding realization stage, things start to get miraculous in a way that means you end up having to shed yourself, right, of the cutting edge ideas and beliefs of your culture, right, the safe ideas, and in this case that would be materialistic or pseudo neuroscientific beliefs about the brain, and so on. And what I'm telling you now also won't fit nicely, will it, into our what can we say, our denuded models of states and stages. It's like, what I'm talking about now, what's that got to do with any of that? Right? How can it possibly relate to it? Well, let me tell you. So I'll tell you my experience of how I came to know what the language of the birds actually means. Now, this phrase, you'll find this phrase in Sufism, right? And you find it in lots of different traditions. Sometimes people think it means that you can understand birds when they chirp and you know what they're saying. You can take certain drugs and listen to birds, and it's like they're having a conversation. You can understand what they're saying, and people think that's what the language of the birds is. That's not what the language of the birds is at all. Remember, they're the messages from the true earth, right? They bring seeds from there to here, and it makes life possible here. They cultivate it. In the last episode, I talked a bit about my background and my relationship with my father. Suffice it to say, so people don't have to go back and listen to that episode if they haven't listened to it. We could basically just say that although I knew my father, he was absent. We can put it that way, which necessitates a certain kind of lack in your life, right? An absence, and with outcomes. Right. And there's no amount of drugs you can take or spiritual practice will make up for that absence. It's not how things work. A number of years ago, I was, I think I was probably doing my practice in meditation, you might say. And a curious feeling arose within me, which was this strange association between magpies and my father. This idea just came up unbidden, and it was curious. And so, what normally happens when something curious like this occurs is I just began to jot down the details, which is it's lower order expression of what's happening that allows me to participate in that larger process more consciously. That's all it does by writing out, right? So I started to draw what these details might have been, and it's very curious. It's like, why am I associating with magpies? And various different scenes popped up in my mind following this thread that involved my father, and I would jot them down. But the feeling of the thread would go beyond these scenes that I'm remembering. Now, normally what happens is when what in Magia we would call a drama, which is what these things would be, right? You can spell them out, allow them to disclose their own nature, and you'll see that they've repeated throughout your life, but they lead back to an origin scene when it was played out for the first time. And that origin scene has the structure of what we can call a false transmission. There's a strong impression is made by someone you look up to, usually a parent or guardian, something like that. You have to be in a very particular state of mind, and you draw a non-verbal false conclusion about your own nature based on this presentation. And that's what gives rise to these dramas. And they repeat themselves whenever you attempt to do the thing that you care about that was initially interrupted by the person making the transmission at the time, right? So the false transmission is you playing out a shadow of what you care about that destroys the thing that you care about, and you only do it at the time you try and do the thing that you care about, right? So in a nutshell, this is binding practice in Magia. We trace it back, we allow it to disclose its own nature until you see what it really is, and then it can't be believed anymore, and then it ceases to arise. We might say you've uprooted that particular tree so it doesn't bear fruit anymore. But this experience I was having jotting down these details with my father, they weren't leading into the past. And after I jotted down 7 or 8, something like this, it sort of dried up, sort of came to an end. And I thought, oh, well, and I put the paper down and the pen, and I stood up to leave my room. I was in this room. Now, the space that I'm in has a very small window in this direction. And you can only see through it when you open the door, when you go to the doorway. Anyway, I got up to leave the room, and as I'm opening the doorway, from the corner of my eye, through the small window, across the road, stood on the guttering of a building in a peculiar way, right? And if it wasn't stood in this way, I wouldn't have been able to see it, was a magpie. So I see the magpie, and this is what always happens. There are 2 thoughts. The first thought is, doesn't mean anything, that's just a coincidence. Keep going. The second thought is, you should go and see what that is. Because there's no chance there would be a magpie there whilst this has been occurring, right? So I obviously I follow the second one, and I walk to the window, wondering what could possibly be going on, right? The magpie then just took off and flew all the way down the street, flew off. And I thought, should have listened to that first thought. It seems like the first thought's been vindicated. This was, just a coincidence, doesn't mean anything. I was about to leave the window when the magpie flew back. It landed in front of me, looked me in the eye, gave a squawk, right? Now, as it did this, what I can only describe as, in the background of my consciousness, something was coming up, something was rising up, and as the magpie landed and then looked me in the eye and spoke, we could say, it reached fruition. It reached fruition. And I was familiar with what its nature is because I've experienced it before. I've experienced it before when I sat with Arunachala Ramana in India. It was transmission. Non-dual abiding transmission. We could put it that way. I'm just trying to emphasize this to try and get across what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the transmission. I've also experienced it in other cases, right? But that was the first time I'd experienced it as transmission. And if I could put into words what was communicated, what is known with a capital K, it was my father is a magpie, or my father was a magpie. Now, the curious thing about this, see, am I sounding like a crazy guy in a potato sack in the forest who's seen too much and gone mad, right? I obviously knew that my dad wasn't actually a magpie. I obviously knew as well the details of my life that hadn't changed. Right, the detail of my life hadn't changed. However, as a result of this transmission, spiritual transmission that happened, non-dual realization as a result of this, what was missing, and it's hard to say what this is, what was missing as a result of my relationship with my father was healed. Now, it was still missing, right? But it was healed. It wasn't missing. I know it's a curious thing to try and express, but that's what happened. So obviously, my father was a biological human being, right? I had the life that I had. But the transmission was my father was actually a magpie, right? And what was missing was no longer missing. It was healed. And then the bird flew off, right? And that's what the language of the birds is. The language of the birds is transmission. The people in the West who are like spiritual teachers, they're magpies. They're like magpies. They're the prophets of the West, the prophets of Europe. That might be another way of putting it. The bird, right? Now, obviously, there's in lots of traditions you find this relationship with birds. In Zen, there's a relationship with ravens, right? But it speaks to geographical location. It speaks to geographical location. After this had happened, I mean, any I'll back up and just say the idea of birds being messages from the true earth means that birds really are messages from the true earth. They have this esoteric component to them. But it also means that the lineage, the Western tradition, the lineage, is made up of magpies or people who have the same function. They do the same thing. It's another way of saying this process is a process of bringing life from somewhere else, from the true earth, and bringing it here and planting it like seeds. So if you recall from our previous conversation, I talked in similar terms about the Magia book being something like that. So anyway, you can see that there's this, there is a very Western, appropriately Western component to what I'm talking about, what I'm describing, that comes from the experience itself, that's organic or innate, to its own expression. And I'd never come across this stuff before. I didn't know what it meant. But then it's always the way with these kinds of experiences is that you later come across elements of it, and you can see that they stretch back into the past. Yeah. Does all of that make sense what I've said so far?
I'm following you.
Yes. And this is what I was going to say. It's like after this experience, I did think to myself, will I ever share this story? Will I ever tell anyone this story? I know what people will think about hearing that story. It's not going to fit in nicely, is it, with practical Dharma? Won't fit in there. Which path was it? What were the states and the stages? Now, this isn't for me to say that there isn't a universal structure that repeats itself as fruit grows on a tree and then is produced, right? I'm not saying that, but what I'm trying to say is the point of it, the meaning of it, the reason it occurs isn't for you to go through states and stages and attain something. It speaks to the fact that healing is real, right? There's a type of healing that is spiritual in nature. It speaks to something else going on in the background that you wouldn't even suspect is the case. It speaks to the role of human beings engaging in this process, what the nature of the world is. It speaks to all of these things. There's little virtue in thinking that this is something to be analyzed in a practical fashion and replicated, and it's only through that, right, that there is virtue in these stories, right? So why would I share the story? I'm sharing the story for all those reasons as a corrective to that. It's the only way I can think of talking about what I've just talked about is that it's miraculous. Miraculous, magical, but in a miraculous sense. Too good to be true. These are the terms that I'd be forced to come up with. If I told you that I read a book, did a practice, then experienced equanimity, or something like that, I can do all of that with never talking about anything miraculous, divine, so on and so forth, what a human being is, and so on. So that would be, the reason for sharing the story would be to say there is a Western tradition. It does exist. It is alive and it's living, and the path speaks to something profound that's beyond a mere technical performance in meditation. Yeah, I've said a lot there, so I'll pause because I imagine it's a lot to digest.
Couple of thoughts, questions. The first is, you mentioned you can see that there's a Western element in this. I'm not sure that I quite saw what's Western about that. So perhaps you could make that explicit, and or repeat it if I missed it. The other thing is that when you talk in terms of culture, use the word ethnic, you use the word geographical, and there's another idea of a kind of a sort of, we could say, idea of liberalism, of an sort of universality. There's this sort of sense of, well, we ought to be able to, people from any place can come to any place and engage in any cultural expression, religious expression, spiritual expression. There's no such thing as a foreign field. They're all just fields, and we're all just going into them, and this sort of idea, right? And sometimes ideas also of culture, ethnicity, place, and so on are maligned, not just rejected on a sort of philosophical ground or metaphysical ground, but also maligned and said, well, this is actually tribalism, maybe there's racism here, right? People say that sort of thing. They're suspicious of that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not leveling those claims, at you. I'm just sort of laying out a bit of a cheese board of opinions. So
it's all the same cheese, American.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think
no cheese at all.
Yeah, that's in a way the blind spot of such a view is it is itself a monoculture in a way, and that's, I think, sometimes not seen. But in any case, then to my third thing. So there's 1, 2, 3. The third thing is what do you see as the potential downsides of somebody going to, if you take your idea as a starting point, of going to another place, perhaps not understanding it the way you do, thinking of it perhaps more in that kind of universal sense. What's going to happen to a person like that, most likely, versus if they were to, say, mine within their own field, the field in which they sprouted culturally, or so on and so forth. So there's three things there, really. The Western element, I've introduced this idea of universality, and I've also asked you about what happens to those that have a different understanding to you and go into these other places.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is this. I'm sure everyone listening to this has noticed the catastrophe unfolding around us everywhere across the West, which is the falsification of the idea of the universal liberal human being. Meaning there's no difference between peoples, places, any of those things, right? This is now catastrophe. This is what we're seeing everywhere. But leaving that aside, and what it means when a cultural drama comes to an end, because that's what we've lived in since the end of the Second World War. It's very much come to an end, right? And now we're in a very different place. But it's the end of a world, the beginning of another one. It's the splitting of the world. Leaving that aside, if one can do such a thing, I'll start with the orientation from Magia, how we think about things. Because there are common ideas like perennialism and traditionalism, capital T, that kind of a thing, where the notion is there's all these different traditions, they're just different paths up the same mountain, right? They're all the same. So why can't I just go to India, learn Advaita there, and then change my mind and go become a Sufi and do a bit, go up the mountain a bit further there, and then whatever, right? Everything's interchangeable. In Magia, there's the other version of that, the other side of that is the idea that there's one tradition and it's the true tradition and all the others are false. Right. So these ideas, right? In Magia, we have something else, a different orientation. It's the idea of the ancestral garden. That means creation itself is a garden. And there are lots of different trees and plants growing in the garden with different degrees of cultivation. What makes a garden beautiful, right, are the differences. It's where the contrast. It's where the flavors are. If I go to this part of the garden, there's some Tibetan Zen. That is a tasty fruit, and I enjoy what's going on over there. Now I'm going to go over here to Julian of Norwich. That's a nice grape. Whatever. I'm laboring these metaphors, but there you go. Right, but you get the idea. It's precisely in the differences. That's what I'm in the garden for. That's what I'm interested in. So the way of thinking about Magia is not that it's one true tradition that has certain people who belong to it, and that's it. It's the recognition that it's a flowering in the garden of a particular type of cultivation, a way of farming or gardening, something like that. But it's a way of appreciating the entire garden. So you should be able to go to a different part of the garden, appreciate what's been cultivated and what hasn't been, right? And then see the difference somewhere else. And everywhere you go, you would say it's the same universal structure, right? But the way that you do your personal practice is very particular, right? It's called Magia, and it has this way of thinking about it and way of engaging with it. It doesn't deny the differences, but it doesn't say there's one tradition and all the others are false. It also doesn't say all the traditions are just one tradition, so it's just one big mush where you mash it together. The move, usually what happens with universalism is we look at all these different varieties of things, and we say, actually, they're all the same. And you destroy them as a result of that. Not only the other that you're looking at, but yourself. Right? And usually that's a convenient way of avoiding uncomfortable details, friction, where things are bumping up against each other. Sometimes that could be the case. So we're interested in the other move. Yes, there's a universal structure, there's one garden, but what are the qualities that we can appreciate, right? And so that's not perennialism, but it's also not traditionalism with a capital T. It's not any of those things. So then that leads me to, okay, if we take that view, what do we mean by going to somewhere else, and or what, a foreign field, something like that? It means that you come from a certain part of the garden. That's where you've sprouted up. So of course you can go to any other part of the garden and appreciate what's there. But it's a task of then accommodating one kind of plant to try and make it another one. Right? Now you can do that. You can torture a plant until or graft on something else, these kinds of things. But it's a lot of work and it's difficult to do. Right? If you don't do that, it doesn't mean that there isn't, an extraordinary contribution to the beauty of the garden that comes from these differences. Does that make sense? Now, hand in hand with that, however, there is the need sometimes for a part of the garden that might be dead, right, to go to a different part and transplant something. So then it might change as a result of being transplanted in that soil. But it's for what can we say? It's to renew a part of the garden that's become dead, right? For various reasons that we could go into. And again, we can label that metaphor in different ways. It's like maybe a crop wasn't cultivated properly, so it died. The ground wasn't prepared, etc., etc. Right? The agricultural analogy is a nice way of understanding practice, and it gives you a nice orientation for it. But I don't want to. If you labor it too much, it can be tedious to listen to. So it was the case with Magia. I had to go to the origin of our civilization, right, for the book to be spoken, to be expressed. But there's another way of thinking about that, which is I had to go there for that to happen, so then I could then transplant it back to England, to Britain, right, and plant it in the middle of the country, which is where I currently live. It's like that's what I had to do. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise. You see, in other spiritual biographies, Crowley had to go to Egypt to do what he needed to do in Egypt. And you again, there's countless examples. So does that there's another way I could put this, like you threw up that example of maybe saying, from the idea that there's just everyone in the world is the same universal liberal mush, right? Which is extraordinarily, what can we say about that? Patronizing, or even insulting, or arrogant, or inflated. That we think everyone else in the world is just like me. And you don't have the imagination that there might be people who see things differently. That's an extraordinary state of inflation. But if you then express that as, oh, there's no such thing as foreign fields, yeah, well, you've murdered it. You've murdered the difference. You've murdered the life that's there, the quality that's there. You've murdered it, and not only that, you've murdered yourself. Because if you deny that, if I deny your nature, I'm denying my own. You know, if I say there's just mush, just the same mush. Did that answer your question, giving that orientation with the ancestral garden?
Yeah, I think that explains how you look at it. So that still leaves a little bit unanswered. Questions 1 and 3. Those are, what is the Western element you were pointing to with your story about the bird? You said you can see there's a Western element there, and I said, well, I wasn't totally sure I knew what you meant by that. And then the third question.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, the third question was, what about people who don't understand things from your point of view? Would take that as the starting point. What's likely to happen to them? What are they going to note? What might they notice?
Oh, yes. So the first one, I mean, I started by leading into it by talking about Merlin. Yeah, this is a Western conception at the beginning of our civilization, medieval expression of it, about what a prophet is, a magician, the holy man, right? It's a very particular view. And then there were other elements in there, but the differences. What are the differences? There is an undeniable Gnostic element. So again, I'll go back because I've used this as a particular illustration, but there are lots of others. But part of the Merlin stories, some of them read just like early Gnostic Gospels, where Jesus appears as a child and he'll change shape and turn into an animal, and the way that he behaves is mysterious, can even be frightening, and so on. You find that depiction. So there is a thread there that's like, let's put it in even more basic terms. It's undeniable, isn't it, that we live in a Christian civilization? Right. So there's a difference now from, say, somewhere that might be Buddhist, right? It's very simple. That's a very basic observation, isn't it? What's the inheritance? Well, there's a very particular expression of the tradition that we can see starts with Gnosticism, comes through alchemy. Again, you'll find alchemy in China, right? There are similarities, but there's also differences. And you find this Western occultism. Again, it's peculiar to the West, isn't it? There's a peculiar Western expression to it. I don't know if I'm misunderstanding the question, or if am I laboring the point too much, or is it making sense what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm misunderstanding what you're asking about in terms of being Western.
Yes, I wasn't necessarily asking you to define the Western per se, in your view, but I see what you mean now. It's this idea of the birds and this kind of communication, this Merlin idea. That's the Western element or theme that you were saying is illustrated in your story. I understand now what you mean.
Yes, I mean there are more even more basic things, like we lie down to die. We don't sit up to meditate. Again, a very old practice that goes back to the origins of Western civilization. And so on. There are peculiarities to it.
Yeah. Of course, the Buddha laid down to die too, they say.
When he died? Do you mean when he died?
Yeah.
Yes, but people also sat up in the West as well.
Some people fall over.
No doubt. Yes, yeah. Yes, but there's there are these peculiarities. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, what then happens to let's take what you're saying is to be the case. What then happens to a person? Alan Watts wrote this essay, Beat Zen, Square Zen.
Yes.
And I think we talked about it last time, maybe. And he also there warns against a misapprehending of Zen as a consequence of one's faulty relationship with one's own religious tradition. That's basically his premise there, that those who rebel against authority are drawn in their own religious context, for example, are drawn to the free-flowing nature of Zen, that aspect of it, and they have beat Zen, like the beats. And
Yeah.
there are those who
Mm.
perhaps in a similar reaction to authority in their tradition, or maybe a reaction to the lack of guidance in their tradition. Who knows?
Yes.
They are drawn to. I mean, either one could go
Yeah.
either way. They're drawn to the rigor of Zen, and they have square Zen.
Yeah.
And that's sort of his idea there. So he's saying something similar. So that's what's in my mind when I ask you,
Right.
what have you observed about those people who perhaps unconsciously, unaware of the sort of thing that you're saying and that Alan Watts seems to be saying in that essay, they go into some other place and they pursue that path, unaware maybe of the handicap of their being from a different part of the garden. If we just take your premise as our starting point, without you don't need to necessarily justify that any further, what have you noticed happens to people who do that, unaware of that they're doing that? Are they hindered in their path in some way? Or do they get so far and no further? Is there a fundamental confusion?
Often it means the death of the tradition. So you murder the thing you claim to care about and represent. So that happens a lot when it's transplanted from the east to the west. I'll give you an example. Particular lineage of Soto Zen. Someone undertook the translation of the Shobogenzo, written by Dogen, massive body of work. But the conclusion from the translator is that what Soto Zen is about is very similar to the Alexander technique. And that's the purpose, is to correct your posture, like the Alexander technique. The complete and absolute murdering of what Soto Zen is, from a peculiar niche cultural perspective or drama, we might say, that's Western, right? And the person can't even see that they're doing that, right? But now, if I'm in the West and I want to go and learn Soto Zen, I'm going to this guy reading his text, the translation, right? Oh, it's about the Alexander technique. That's not good for the person doing the translation. It's not good for the student, the person reading about it. It's not even good for the scholar who might be wondering about, the veracity of the translation. Like what are the subtle changes that might have happened as a result of someone seeing it in this way? I mean, the thing you mentioned with the authority stuff, that's another great example. Hating the idea of authority so much, right? There's a perverse element of Western cultural drama, is this pathological expression of being anti-authoritarian, and then thinking. I mean, imagine thinking that a Japanese Zen tradition, right, is anti-authoritarian. I mean, it requires such cultural blindness, right, that it's staggering. That you look at Zen and think it's just free. It's just a free-floating emptiness, But then it becomes that, when it gets transplanted. I mean, people, Dogen, right? Sometimes Dogen cited in terms of Soto Zen, the founder. People don't realize that, like, in his monastery, he had rules that dictated everything monks did, from the position that they slept in to how they would urinate. It was like a million rules, right? Totalitarian, you might say, right? That's Zen. This is Soto Zen. That's what it is. And then one has to ask, what are the fruits that are only possible through a path like that is now inaccessible, right, for people who are supposed to be pursuing that path, who think that it's some kind of free-floating punk-like activity, anti-authoritarian and so on. Do you know what I mean? Now, that question I don't even think is even entertained. I don't think it occurs to people. To be aware of one's, we can look at it from another perspective, which is to be aware of the possibilities that might unconsciously be playing out in terms of your behavior as someone seated within a particular cultural inheritance or a people or whatever. Often that is recognized by a tradition, right? And they have ways of addressing it or understanding it right, that can speak to it. Without that tradition, then you're not going to find those particularities addressed by other traditions from other cultures. They have their own peculiarities to deal with that they might recognize. Could even lead to a misdiagnosis about what it is that's occurring, and so on. So I don't know. Does that answer the first question? I think that answers the first question. That's a potential example, yeah. I'll tell you what. There's one other thing I'll say. A huge part of the Western inheritance is scholasticism, right? It comes out of a peculiar difference between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church as to how one pursues knowledge of God. But anyway, this peculiarity in interpretation leads to scholasticism, and it's the idea of intellectualism as a path to realizing understanding the nature of God. But we have, and it's where science comes out of that, right? The nature of the mind and the nature of thought, and our engagement with that. There are some traditions that don't have the same kind of presupposed unconscious assumptions about the nature of the intellect, right, and the value that we place on it. We do this like breathing in the West, right? And therefore there needs to be a different appreciation for how someone might be relating to the mind and the nature of thought that might not exist, say, in the East. It's a different way of approaching thought. There are parodies of that where and I would even say a misreading, but there are parodies of that where these traditions, when they get transplanted into the West, it becomes anti-thought or anti-intellectual or something like this. And this is, and again, we can only frame it that way as Westerners, right? We have this particular view of what thought must be, and then what it must mean not to think about thought or to include thought, right? Which I think actually isn't there. It's nuanced in a different way in the East, right? So in a Western tradition that's appropriate to a Westerner, that's in there. The logos is in there. The understanding of what the nature of thought is in its proper place, and therefore how to engage with it. That is, again, it speaks to being in a certain part of the garden where that quality of spiritual fruit has been cultivated, and it's something we've inherited. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that answers that first question then. The third question, what was the third question?
I'm curious what you've observed. If we take your position, as that you've described here, and
yeah.
I'm saying, Alan Watts, I think you're not alone necessarily in thinking along these lines, at least that one essay by Alan Watts and others, of course. What have you observed in people who not seeing things that way, go into a foreign field? What happens to them? Let's say the pragmatic Dharma people, for example. There's this idea, isn't there, that conversion, there's different ways to convert. One way of converting is you really convert and you try to take on all the assumptions and leverage points and reference points of, you swallow the whole thing, culture as well as doctrine, and that's one of the appeals of conversion, is you get to become a different person, and that's why one of the reasons people convert. Other people convert, and what they're doing, really, they bring all their assumptions with them, and they conform the tradition to themselves. If we say that's an extreme, it becomes a sort of skin suit for their own presuppositions, culturally or whatever it might be. So we could say those are sort of two extremes. In any case, what about those people that in the, say, pragmatic Dharma movement and others who you see going to foreign fields? Do they get stuck? Is there a limit to what they can do? Are they misunderstanding it? You've said that they can murder the traditions, fair enough. But what happens to them on their path?
I would preface this just by saying this, though. I just want to make sure that this is understood. The that searching, that need to belong, right, to a tradition. There's one expression of this is it happens as a drama on the path that gets resolved such that the question doesn't arise anymore. Right? It's very common to find. I mean, there's two very common variations of this. Before someone wakes up, there can be this searching, looking for the right one that's going to do the thing that you want it to do. Right? So you've already got presumptions that you're bringing with it there. You will denude traditions of things that you think aren't the thing that you're looking for, but you don't know what you're talking about or why it's even there. Right? And perhaps you don't understand that as well because of the cultural barrier. So it just seems foreign to you, so you best get rid of it, right? So that can be very common. You want the real thing or the thing that's going to work, and therefore, and then traditions are treated like tools, you know, or a raft to cross a river that you can then throw away. Which some people then bring that up from the Buddha. My contention is, if a teaching is only true before you wake up, then it's not accurate. It should be true before, during, and after any awakening. Anyway, leaving that aside, after realization, abiding non-dual realization, right? And you think you're an awakened human. Now I'm an awakened human being. There is this perceived disparity between what's been realized and one's behavior, and it needs to be expressed culturally, institutionally, right, habitually. It needs to be dealt with in some way. One becomes obsessed with morality, enlightened action, what's unenlightened action, and so then sometimes people they really go on the search. I need to find the tradition to ensconce myself in, and then this question will be answered for me. This apparent lack of divine activity or relationship, that apparent absence, it'll be made up for with this tradition, with this way of thinking about this human-made morality. That'll make up, you know, for the lack. So in some regards, those dramas do come to an end, and it disappears. The real longing or need to belong to a tradition, if we can put it this way, isn't really a concern about belonging to a tradition identifiable in a certain way. It's more like the silent knowing that's the impetus behind you learning all of the words and the practices, and even looking for a tradition in the first place, right? And being conscious of any of this stuff. That thing, if you just follow that, maybe you need to go somewhere else to pick something up, right? And then come back with it. I'm thinking of like people like Kukai, the founder of Shingon Buddhism, right? He famously got on board a ship, didn't he? And traveled for 2 weeks, could have died. Went to China, found a guy teaching Tantra, picked up what he needed to pick up, right? Went back to Japan, created a new Japanese flowering of the tradition, uniquely Japanese, even down to the use of the written language, right? It comes from this expression, this cultivation. That's following something that's innate, and you follow that, and where you find yourself in the garden is appropriate to your nature, because that's what you've been following, right? And that so there's a work that needs to be done in a certain place in a certain way, which may even speak to the nature of incarnation, why it is the way that it is in the first place. But the question doesn't have to arise like, where do I find the tradition that I should belong to? But one does belong to a tradition to the extent that one is doing the work where one needs to do it. And it's precisely because the garden, it has this variety, right, that any work is possible in the first place. Does this make sense what I'm trying to communicate? So I'm talking about the fact that there's the reality of a Western tradition because people think that there isn't. I'm saying that there's a living expression of it now that's available because people might not expect it, or if they hear someone say there's a Western tradition, they think maybe it's been academically reconstructed, because you see a lot of that at the moment. and it's not even that, right? But beyond that, it's not, the injunction is not, oh, you're a Westerner, so you should immediately just do this one tradition, and you've got nothing to do with any other tradition. No person is in a position to draw that conclusion about where the work needs to be done. On the contrary, what happens is the more you go through this process, the more ignorant you realize you are, and not only that, the more humility you need, because you'll think you'll know where you're going and why you're going there, and what you're going there to do. Right? But time and again, you will be shown that you don't have the wisdom to understand why that is the case. Right? But that wisdom requires you being willing to allow what you're following to disclose its own nature. You have to do that, and it has its own nature, which means particularities, which means particular work in terms of the metaphor, the analogy in the garden. Yeah, so I wanted to preface it by saying this, right? Because this can turn into traditionalism with a capital T. I don't know how familiar you are with that. The idea with traditionalism with a capital T is that it's a form of perennialism. Yes, all these traditions do lead up the same mountain, but what you should do is you should pick the tradition that's appropriate to your culture, right? And it always turns into a traditional chauvinism. They'll say you pick the best one depending on where you are, but they always end up expressing the fact that the one they've picked is the best one in the world. It always happens. Anyway, that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about the garden, right? That's not, again, I'm coming back to the ancestral garden, the understanding of that. It may be that what someone is looking for, revealing its own nature, disclosing its own nature, is what I'm talking about. Oh, that's Magia that I'm looking for. I can see it. Oh, there it is over there. I'll go and have a look. Oh, that's it. That's the thing I'm looking for. It shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise, and you should expect that there are many elements to it that are unconsciously familiar, right? Right. So okay, that's my big caveat. So what happens to people who do look in foreign fields for the treasure? In some ways, you can say, and being charitable, if you have any degree of realization or reality to the process, you haven't found treasure in a foreign field, right? You found it where it actually is, in yourself, right? That can be despite the strange searching for it in a foreign field, or the strange fetishization of Eastern stuff, like an Orientalism, right? It can be despite that. But it can lead to, if you have a particular image, and the thing that you're experiencing doesn't look similar to what it's supposed to look like, right? Because it's expressed from a culture that you're not familiar with. Have you ever read a translation of any Tibetan text? Like a Mahamudra or Dzogchen? Okay, good luck with that. Good luck with lining up your experience with that text, right? I know people do, right? And obviously the best way of doing that is to work with the teacher and so on and so forth, right? But good luck with that, right? You see there the difficulty, right? It's not as straightforward. It's not as straightforward as you might think. You can end up, what can we say? Either distorting or ignoring or dismissing your own personal experience as a result of that. You could go further and say, if there's some pathological expression that's overbearingly practical in the West, you can have a similar thing, right? Where the image that you have is causing you unnecessary suffering with your own experience. That doesn't need to be the case. Doesn't need to be the case. But even then, in those examples, I am actually talking about a perverted Eastern tradition that's been twisted and changed to fit a Western perspective. So even there, it's still there. Okay, so I said I was being generous. So hopefully, what happens is people can follow that path so far, and then they realize that the reality is bigger than that. The reality is bigger than that. Hopefully, they don't get stuck. Sometimes you can just get stuck because the imagery doesn't provide the necessary symbolic gateway for what might come next. Right? It's just a barrier. It's just a barrier, or the reason why you have a perverted or distorted view of an Eastern tradition is because it's been twisted in that way to fit your pre-existing rationalist, materialistic beliefs. Right. So you'll stay with that imagery so far, and then you won't go any further because these other beliefs might have to go as well at the same time if you go any further than that. So you could get stuck. Hopefully, if we were to be, and hope for the best, maybe someone recognizes some of this stuff, and maybe they do go deeper into an Eastern tradition, aware of these things, and it's something they contend with in their lives. So the wiser Western teachers of these traditions, you see them do this. You see that they recognize the stuff that I'm talking about, and you see them do this. It doesn't mean they abandon the tradition. It may be that they're called to have to do work in that tradition, or do something in the future with something they've inherited from that somewhere else. Who can say? I don't have the wisdom to say. Yes, but with all of these things, the virtue talking about is simply to make these things conscious, the possibilities of these things conscious. And if the possibilities are at least conscious, it's then possible, isn't it, that you might recognize it in your own experience.
That's interesting. So you're not saying that one should do the tradition, so to speak, of where you grew up or where you were born or something. You're not saying that. You're saying that traditions grow up in certain cultural milieu, and they have leverage points that interact with that cultural, maybe edifice is a better word at this point, edifice, so that when someone enters the tradition from within that culture, there's a match, the culture that the tradition is dialoguing with. And to fail to recognize that is to fail to recognize either the uniqueness of the tradition or the ways in which you're coming from a slightly different angle as you enter into dialogue with that tradition, something along those lines.
I think so. Yeah. So again, I can use these examples of Western teachers in Eastern traditions. All the better teachers, they're aware of this stuff. So much so that they may wonder about the future of that lineage in the West. There's a real possibility that actually, I don't think this is going to work, or it's not working in a particular way, or something like this. So again, it's not that what can I say? It's not necessarily the case that your work might be to deal with that in some way. I don't know. I don't have the wisdom to talk about that. Miraculous things occur. But it is the case that there are these dramas around tradition. There is this, putting these Eastern, like this fascination with Eastern stuff and putting it on a pedestal because it's alien, out-group preference, that kind of a thing, the novelty of it. That's certainly, these are also things. And this is not what I'm talking about with the better Western teachers, that are having to deal with the incompatibility of some Eastern stuff with Westerners, or the Western mindset. But nevertheless, they're there. So I would say, if I had advice for someone who's they're starting to go through this process, but they've not woken up or anything like that, right? My advice to them would be this: be conscious of the fact that you're treating traditions like a strategy, right? People will do stuff like they'll go on retreat, right, and secretly they'll sneak off and do other practices during the retreat and come back and do those practices, because you never know, do you? You never know which technique or method is going to lead to the awakening. Who can say? right? I would say to those people, like, be aware that that's what you're doing. Understand that this is an unnecessary drama. You don't have to indulge it, right? If you found a teacher or a practice that you believe to be authentic, that you found what you're looking for or whatever, trust what you've been trusting all along to guide you through that, so that you're not doing this, hedging your bets. Hedging your bets as if awakening is a gamble, right? As if the most profound thing you can do as a human being, right, is a game where it will or will not happen because of luck or something like that. Yes. As for those people post awakening, my advice to them is a similar thing. Be conscious of the fact that you're looking you're looking to make up for this absence of what is essentially divine action, or the relationship that the nature you've woken up to has with itself, right? How it's expressed, and the you're trying to plug a hole with human-made morality, as if the nature you've realized doesn't have its own relationship to itself that is inherently good. Right, that's what its nature is. It's the way sometimes you see mystics, and you see them in the Christian tradition, medieval Europe. They talk about this. You get to a level of realization where you can say there's no morality anymore, something like that. It doesn't mean you can do anything you like, or there's no such thing as good and evil. What it means is you don't need man-made morality from institutions to make up for an absence that isn't there. Instead, you have the effortless expression of a nature that is inherently good. It has this relationship with itself. It's inherently good, right? That might remind you of teachings by people like Chogyam Trungpa, or you see it in other traditions where he talks about the inherent nature of a human being is good. Right? I don't know if you remember that teaching. Yeah, he's also an example of his story also belies this fact that I'm talking about. In terms of the garden, the nature of the garden, he comes to the West, and what does he do? He discovers a terma, which is a hidden book, right? He brings forth a hidden teaching, a hidden book called Shambhala, and he has to do that because the teaching has to be expressed in an appropriate way for Westerners, right? So he's a guy coming from the East. He's coming from Tibet, isn't he? He brings the teaching, and it's like, this isn't going to work. There needs to be a fresh expression, a new expression of this tradition for Westerners, right? So again, you see this this reality expressed in many different ways. Countless examples, in biographies and so on.
One other little distinction I'd like to parse in terms of your thinking on this, and you've mentioned Shingon, and now you're talking about Chogyam Trungpa's efforts to express what he had in unique terms or particular terms to the context into which he was speaking. Tibetan Buddhism itself, if we think of the history of its transmission, very conscious, deliberate, importing really from India into Tibet, or we think of Christianity and its emergence and then its synthesis with Greek philosophical thought. But my point is that you've already mentioned, and I've added some other examples, and that religions don't just spring up in a place. Very often there is, in the formation of these religions, profound intercultural exchange that then makes something that we consider to be a very, very of a certain place. And some people are saying, some people do, some people even go so far as to call it a fourth turning, which I think is perhaps a little premature, but people do say that to put it mildly, that this sort of this importing of Buddhism into America, really, let's face it,
this is an example of what I was talking about before, but go on.
Is in fact a kind of a founding of a sort of new tradition and so on. Anyway, So I won't keep going on and on. How do you see that intercultural exchange? Because it might be possible to misinterpret some of what you're saying as this
Yeah.
aspects of what you've said. This idea that there's a sort of Western, hermetically sealed, if you'll excuse the pun, from other influences, or so on and so forth. But that's not historically the case. How do you see that cultural exchange, and how does that relate to what else you've said about place and so on?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is this: I don't think much of the idea of cultural exchange, as in a history of ideas. Like the you can trace ideas from here, they go from here, they obviously learn it from these people here, that kind of a thing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things like Abaris, the figure Abaris. He comes from the Mongolian steppes. He travels great distance. He traveled a great distance to intentionally seed Western civilization. He meets Pythagoras and in the Mediterranean, right? So a movement from the east to the west. It's not a group of people who are like, I'm looking for a tradition. Where can I find it? Oh, I've read some books about the East. Oh, I'll go and learn that. Right? It's not that. Someone intentionally in a different state of mind comes and seeds something through transmission in the West to then be cultivated by people at the beginning of Western civilization, right? Intentionally. So you've got this movement. However, it's so something unique can spring up in that place. That's why they've gone there to do it. And it moves back and forth, east and west. There were some things from the west, so we get Empedocles, Empedocles in the west, Mediterranean. His stuff disappears in the west and goes into the east, goes into Sufism, and it's preserved there before it can come back again. So it goes where it needs to go, but it doesn't mean that there's no east or west. It doesn't mean that there isn't a particular flowering in a particular place for a particular reason that's consciously done. Right. So that is what I would say is the thing that I'm talking to, as opposed to what's normally meant by, cultural exchange, where that you can trace ideas moving, and the on the surface, that kind of a thing. So I'm saying something that's much more esoteric than that. Going back to the birds, bringing something from somewhere else and planting the seeds here, without which there wouldn't be a civilization or a culture. Humans don't come up with cultures or civilizations. They come from somewhere else, and we get to participate in them and cultivate them, right? But there's the possibility we don't cultivate what's potentially in there, and instead we do something else. Instead, we live out our own particular fate, which is what we've done in the West. Just as an aside, if people think that what I'm saying is complete nonsense, look at any major scientific breakthrough and look at the origin story of where it comes from. Where did Descartes get his philosophy from? Where does the DNA helix? Everyone knows this story. Where does that come from? And so on and so on. And we have sanitized our scientific past, where these things come from. But nevertheless, it's there if we just scratch the surface. Yes. So from that perspective, then what I'm trying to say is that if there's work, you don't know if you're Abaris, right? You don't know if you're that dude. Maybe that's what you end up having to do, but it doesn't mean Mongolia doesn't exist, or Greek civilization doesn't exist, and that they're uniquely different from each other. It means that those superficial differences. That's where we have the flavor. And it's where we have, there's an intentional expression in that way for a reason. It's like saying a sentence. You're not going to say the same sentence over and over. There needs to be a different expression from one sentence to the next to communicate anything. Right? There's why would the next sentence I say is different from the previous one. It doesn't mean that I hate sentences. Or I think one sentence is superior to another. Right. Anyway, I don't know if that was a silly metaphor. But I think I'm anyway, yes. So okay. The The one thing I wanted to say about Christianity and the Abrahamic traditions is that they don't start in the Middle East. They start in the Mediterranean, or rather Mesopotamia, in that area, and there's a massive what can we say? There's a massive sharing of culture there. That part of the Middle East was Hellenized at the time. The Christian church would have you believe that they accommodated in Platonism and Greek thought. They've accommodated it in there, but it's the other way around. The Greek stuff comes first, and Christianity, and even then, the expression of Judaism that comes out of that is intensely Hellenized, right? It's not hermetic. To use the word you used, like there's this presentation of those traditions as if they were hermetically closed off, and they've developed and then taken over, and so therefore they're foreign. You know, you were mentioning that, weren't you, about it being Semitic and they don't belong? It's like that's not true. They were a part of Western civilization, you know, and that Western civilization didn't start 2,000 years ago. It started 2,500 years ago. If we use Aberys as the marker or something like that. That was my take on that. Yes, I forget what was the other question. Was there another question there?
Actually, I think this distinction you made there between looking at religions as cultural exchange, a kind of history of ideas lens, and this more other esoteric understanding that you're talking about, I actually think that may be a key distinction in what you're saying. So a history of ideas would see religious traditions, cultural traditions through migration of peoples, trade routes, war, and so on, interacting with each other in various different ways, supplanting, integrating, whatever. And that this porousness is part of the way in which religious traditions arise. I think that's a sort of standard historical perspective on, as you say, the history of ideas and that sort of thing. But you're saying something which I think, and you made a distinction between what you're saying, which sounds awfully a lot like that at times, and actually you're saying something very, very different indeed. And that is that culture and insight, such as even scientific insight, is coming from somewhere else. And I don't suppose that you mean that phrase in a casual sense. I suppose there's something really behind what you're saying there. And we can participate in this or go our own way and live out our fate. And that's what we've done in the West. I think I'm more or less quoting what you said. Yeah. So perhaps towards, maybe we should start to think about the end of this particular conversation, but perhaps you could make even more explicit this esoteric understanding of culture and insight that differentiates it from this more historical kind of history of ideas perspective that I was putting forward.
I think the earliest, the more primal, or what can we say, primary expression of it is the notion that life doesn't come from this world at all. There is no life that comes from this world. It's brought here from somewhere else, another world, a different world. And it's the mixture of these two together that's responsible for creation. So a creation is a mixture of these two worlds coming together, right? One being found through the other. The life side of it, being, capital B, life, capital L, right? There's none of that is found here. This world, when I say this world, I mean existence, appearance. If you're a Buddhist, you might say, the interdependent arising of things that you cannot find self in those things. There's no self or no soul, depending on what interpretation you want to go with. So it amounts to the same thing for my purposes. It's only going to lead to disappointment or suffering or dissatisfaction, and it has no permanence, right? Well, there's something that has those qualities, right? You might argue Satchitananda, seen as Buddhism comes out of Hinduism, but there's something that is self, that is you, that is permanent, that is fulfilling, etc., right? And you might say that's actually the first turn, the second turning of the wheel, introduction of Mahayana Buddhism, right? Two worlds, one found through the other. So that life being brought here, I started this conversation by talking about birds. That's what birds do. Human beings, however, we have a shared nature in that regard. So if I was talking about the silent knowing or something like that, that's like a seed that's been brought here. If we cultivate that seed, if we fulfill the function like the birds, that's like being the prophets of Europe. That's like being the Western version of what the holy man is, or something like this. That's what it means to walk this path. That's what we do. And it's a very particular understanding, isn't it? Anyone who's actually read or is familiar with Christian theology will also recognize it, a mixture of two worlds coming together. So within that, then we can talk about life just as we think about it. Animals, humans, plants, that kind of a thing. Subset of that is culture or civilization. They're alive like living beings. They have a beginning, they have an end, they have a lifespan. And they're like organisms, and they have their own particular natures. So it would follow that I mean, culture isn't an exception. Where does culture come from? The same place where all life comes from, right? But it's not this world of shadow. It's not this world of conditionality. It doesn't come from here, right? But we find it through here, don't we? We find it through conditionality. Sometimes, despite conditionality, we find it. And that's so that would be the orientation in terms of how to think about things. And just like all living things, we have a destiny, which would be to cultivate that seed, right? A divine inheritance that can produce fruits here, right? We can pursue that. Or we can instead of following that, we can follow appearances, and we just live out our fate and we die. And we're dead. We're just dead. Right. These two options would then also apply. If they apply to all animals or humans or whatever, it's going to apply to cultures. Right. And that gives us a perspective on what's occurring in the world, where we find ourselves, what's actually going on in the world, right? Despite the delusions of our culture or civilization. So we have a particular kind of cultural delusion where we're in love with our false light, the false light of our own culture. I suspect the idea of a fourth turning, yes, is exactly this warping of an Eastern idea or tradition to fit a particular Western delusion or pathology, which is the idea of progress. Things are just getting better. And do you know when Buddhism gets the best? It's when it's finally Western. When it's finally transplanted here, this is the new revolution, This is it. This is where this is what the fourth turning is. Now, maybe you think you could just write me off as a cynic. Maybe I'm just being cynical, in the conventional sense, not the philosophical sense. And maybe it's unfair. Maybe there is something going on, under the surface. But what do we see that's occurring? What is the development? I mean, the turning of the wheels means of the with the three turnings, you end up with a total image of creation. You end up with the historical Buddha, who's a human being who teaches that the nature of this place. You then get the expression of the other world, right? Your inheritance, what that is. But esoteric Buddhism is then the realization that beyond the suffering, you find a cosmic Buddha, right? For whom this is the expression of pure joy. Right? It's a complete cosmological image. If there was going to be a fourth turning, I would expect a development in that understanding. Right? That's all I see is the idea that because something's becoming Western or something, mashed together with science, maybe I don't know what are the particularities, right? I'd like to see, some contribution, but I don't know if that's again, maybe I'm just being cynical.
Well, to be perhaps slightly more precise about this fourth turning idea, and one can buy it or not, but I think the idea is sometimes expressed that, science, the spirit of science, neuroscience in particular, usually, which, of course, some say is the sort of prognosticating of blobs on screens and so on. But in any case, that somehow that will contribute an understanding, perspective on Buddhism, for example, that will sort of take it to a new level, enhance its effectiveness, presumably. I mean, I think that's the idea of. It's not so much that just.
Yes, I just find it staggeringly patronizing.
Yes.
I don't know if people know anything about neuroscience, but there's a replicability crisis. Every TED talk you've ever seen, this is a glib way that I put it, every TED talk you've ever seen is incorrect. It's all based on science that can't be replicated from extraordinarily poor studies from neuroscience. We know vanishingly little about the brain. Vanishingly little. And then the idea that if we strip everything out of Buddhism that actually helps people going through the tradition, through the path, right? Strip all of that out, and then we're going to add the fruits of our so-called neuroscience, right? And then that's going to take it to another level. It's just astonishingly arrogant. Yes, and if anyone's ever done a review of the literature, you see the studies, the study design, they talk about gold standard. It's beyond a joke. It's beyond a joke, that stuff. I'm speaking like this because I spent some time putting together a study program. So I reviewed that stuff. I thought about what would be the best way of studying awakening. How would it best be expressed? What's the best model, the best approach? And I was astonished by what I found. The standard of it. I was working with someone who's I think his title was like a neuropsychologist, PhD. So he had training with statistics and that kind of a thing. But even the stuff I learned from him, what they were trained in and that kind of a thing. And then you see these programs in America, particularly in America, where you can sign up and pay a few $1,000s, whatever it is, to take part in a so-called scientifically validated program to wake up. The language that they use, the acronyms, and so on and so forth. And it's a gold standard research, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Anyway, so on that cheery note, that's what I think about the fourth turning. I mean, we are at the end of a culture. We're at the end of a civilization, and if that's not apparent to people, I don't know what you would need to demonstrate that would be the case. So, I mean, you never know, though. Seeds can be planted in ground to hibernate, to stay there for some time, to sprout at a later date, and there can be a wisdom there that's beyond the scope of what humans can guess at. So who can say? Maybe there'll be a fourth turning in the future.
There's that saying, this reminds me of the way you're talking here about that saying. Sometimes you'll say someone's a bit full of themselves. He thinks he's the second coming. You hear that, the second coming of Christ. Maybe we can add a new term. He thinks he's the fourth turning.
Yes. Yeah.
Alan Chapman, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.